everything begins with the actual historical problem. The title of this live stream is "The Quran was not a book." And it's like, well, hang on a minute. What do you mean? It's been the book, like from day one, from the time of Muhammad, or from anything. It's always been like this. Well, there are some problems with that theory. We have very few accounts from outside of the standard Islamic narrative, so from independent sources, talking about Islam during the early days, like Sebios, and in this case, John of Damascus, and so on. Now, most of them, they don't really speak about the stories about Muhammad. It's almost as though they had not been created yet. Anything that they discuss doesn't really match the narrative. But what about the Quran? This is the thing. So we have John of Damascus. You have his dates there. So 675 to 749. So he wrote his Fount of Knowledge, or the Heresy of the Ismailites, probably around the year 730. It's probably a good assumption that these sort of people would write when they have really been very experienced in life and discussing and debating with many people for many years. And then during the last 20 years of their lives is when they do their best works. So that's pretty much like the date that it is accepted. So we would be at around the 730s with John of Damascus. And he doesn't mention the Quran. He talks about a book. He says that these people are following a false prophet called Muhammad, as he puts it right there. You can see it on the screen. And he says, and they follow this certain book, but he doesn't call it by name, which is odd. Maybe you look at some translations and someone would have put on his account, like they follow the Quran, but that's not there. He didn't actually write the name of the book, which is a little bit curious. Particularly when he is making these accounts for the church to know what is going on, he would have all of the details presented to the church, and his account is quite detailed in some areas. So you would expect the name to be there, but it isn't, but that's fine. The letters from Leo III and Umar II. So these two caliphs coincided between the year 720 and 723. Some dates are given like 717, around that time. And in these letters, Leo says to Umar, calls about this particular book, but he doesn't call it a book or Quran. He actually calls it Furqan. And this is about 100 years after the term should have been coined. It should have been already widely used. So you would expect that if anyone is talking about that book, is going to call it the Quran. Now, we know that Muslims will say, well, Furqan is the same as Quran. Sometimes they will say that, and probably we're going to see other places from the standard Islamic narrative where that happens. But that doesn't make any sense. It's like when they say that Ahmad is Muhammad. It's like, but nobody has actually called Muhammad Ahmad, like not once. It's just because in your book it says that Jesus says that someone will come after him whose name is Ahmad, which is a call to the Holy Spirit, and very clearly so. And they say, no, that's our Muhammad. The same thing happens with Quran. So if they see this account that they call the book Furqan, which would be Furqan because there is no P in Arabic, they would conclude, no, it's our book. It's always been our book. It's the same, Furqan, Quran. No, it's not the same. Think about how important the Quran is these days. They know the name and they think that that has been the only name for history. They cannot actually point at something like this and say, oh, well, back in the day, you could call it one thing or another. All of those things would make no sense. So we are 100 years after the time of Muhammad, as given by the standard Islamic narrative, and we don't have sources from outside of the standard Islamic narrative or contemporary sources, because the Islamic sources are much later and then redacted back, that actually say this book is the Quran. We don't have it. Now, this is based on our research, but if you're watching, you are familiar of any other accounts that we haven't seen that pushes the name Quran as the book to earlier, hopefully 8th century. Let us know in the comment section below. We will investigate that and so on. But please don't just simply go to like ChatGPT and ask, oh, tell me when Quran is mentioned, before the 8th century, because it will tell you something. But
I'll give you the
yeah,
exact answer that the GPT model will give you. The GPT model will give you, oh, it's been called Quran ever since the early 7th century because we have manuscripts where it uses the word Quran as a reference to itself, and therefore it must have been called Quran from the very, very beginning. But that's an anachronism, because you're saying that a undotted Rasim, which didn't have the Hamza yet, and so forth, you're saying that therefore, right, the GPT will say, oh, that's the first attestation because it's kind of drinking the Kool-Aid a little bit. Um,
yeah,
that's what it'll say. But what we're looking at here is the question of what the name of a book is, right? Look, Bible. You know, maybe there's another tradition that calls it something else or whatnot, right? There's names for books, and we're told, and this is the thing: if we look at the Quranic text and it's talking about itself as the name Quran, then presumably it would have been the obvious. Of course, it's called Quran. God calls the book Quran. We would call it nothing else. That would be rude, right? However, we see various names. We see in history, we see Surah al-Baqarah, so it's naming the book after the first chapter, or the second chapter after Fatiha, and then naming the book Burkan, as Leo does here. We also see people refer to the book as a certain book. There was one more that came to mind that I forgot, but those are the main ones. So in history, in the beginning, it seems that Furqan took prominence at the time of Leo, and especially to consider this, right? So John of Damascus is a very learned man who lives inside of Damascus. So he's in the court of the Umayyads. Okay, so he isn't someone who's an outsider who may, oh, you know, you can't blame him for not naming knowing the name of the book. He would have known. And the same goes for Leo III. This is the emperor of, I think at the time, the biggest empire of the world at the time, right? Byzantium. So these people would have known. So it seems that the name Furqan began as an emerging name because in the 730s, which is where Damascus, yeah, John of Damascus and Leo right around the same time, right?
yes, pretty much it would have been between, let's say, between 715 and 730, these two accounts would have been written.
So around the same time, you have one person saying a certain book, not naming it, being silent on the issue, and then Leo saying your Purkan, which is clearly referring to Furqan, which is referring to Purkana in the Syriac, meaning salvation. So they would be calling in this context the book their salvation, as means to salvation or whatever interpretation you can see. The core point here is simply that the actual historical sources that we have that we can rely on do not attest the name Quran as being the name of this book.
Certainly. And actually, like you said, John of Damascus, he's the one who actually calls these people Ishmaelites, Saracens, and Haggarins. So this person actually is trying to give as much information as he possibly can. He certainly would have said not a certain book as if it is something distant. He would have said a book that is called this or whatever it is. And now you can say, well, but Jesus never says Bible and Jesus never says Christians. And it's like, yeah, maybe read the story and see why. That is obvious. But not in Islam. In Islam, it's supposed to be there, just like Kash has just said, that the book itself keeps saying Quran, Quran, Quran. So it would have been the word that everybody uses for this text, but it doesn't seem to be the case. But as I said, if somebody actually finds another early source, that it will help us to actually pin down the actual time when that word is introduced. But by the time that we get to these guys, it looks like it is not associated, the word Quran, with the book.
Right, so then we're at Al-Kindi, so we're in the 9th century now. Our sources, so what we know about Al-Kindi is that he was born around 801 and died in 873. And like you said about the last 20 years of the life, that's sort of a general rule. So we'll estimate, you know, mid 9th century would be where we have the works of Kindi attested. However, the dating on his works is not that firm. So we'll read. First of all, then I must put before you the origin of the Quran. Afterwards you may press your claim if you can, a false claim which cannot abide the truth or stand examination. Well then, there was a certain Christian monk named Sergius, who had perpetrated some offense for which his companions disowned him and excommunicated him, refusing him, as was their wont, access to their churches, won't access to their churches and intercourse with them, repenting of what he had done. So the whole thing about Sergius is a whole different rabbit hole. There's a bunch of stuff that can be said about that. But the point here about Al-Kindi is that we finally get a reference to Quran. Al-Kindi appears to be the first attestation of the word Quran being the name of this religious text. And that's then in the 850s, roughly. And then it's not in a slide here, but Nicetas of Byzantium is also worth noting, because Nicetas of Byzantium in the 860s, well, not even just the 860s, exactly the year 860, so we can more confidently make a dating here, he uses the word Quran, and therefore we can attest confidently, like we looked in the 730s with Leo and with John of Damascus, right? We had two sources that were roughly around the same time. One of them had no idea, or wasn't confident, or didn't say, and the other one said it was Burkan, right? So two witnesses, like the Lord says, there must be two witnesses. We have the witness of no name, and then we have the witness of Burkan. Now we go 100 years later, let's say 120 some years later, right? We're in the middle of the 9th century now, let's say year 850 or whatnot, and we have two attestations in a plus minus 10-year frame here, where you have Al-Kindi saying the word Quran, and then Nicetas of Byzantium saying the word Quran. So it seems abundantly that this is the time frame, this is the period where it's attested. So by the mid-9th century is what my estimate I would give, is that's the time period where the word Quran takes shape.
Right. And for anyone who is familiar with the works of the likes of J. Smith, for instance, he makes it very clear that the things like the hadiths, they're actually written around, probably in the early 800s at the earliest. So really that's when Al-Bukhari and all of those people are meant to have been writing their stuff, although we don't have any manuscripts, so quite a few of those things could be even from many hundreds of years later. But everything seems to be pointing at this particular period of time. So we know that in the year 750 is when the Umayyads lose the caliphate, and now it goes to the Abbasids. We know that they are writing the hadiths, nothing is written before that. They are writing the Sirah, and it looks like there is a big problem with the word Quran as well, because before that, the only sources that we have, as I said, we have found, you can actually tell us if you find something else, it seems to point at the fact that they didn't call that book the Quran. They didn't do the association of Quran is an actual book. The Quran is in the book, it's written in the book, but does it actually mean a book? No, because otherwise that's what they would have called it. It didn't have that name to begin with. And there are lots of other places in the Quran that makes us go, hang on a minute, there is a problem here, just like we've shown with the mountain. This is another example in Surah 2, verse 185, when it says, the month of Ramadan, which the Quran was made to descend. And it's like, okay, that's fine. So the Quran was made to descend in the month of, but it didn't. We know that according to the Islamic sources, first of all, the Quran was never descended, never in a way that you would understand it from a verse like this. It's not like a whole book was actually sent down from the heavens. According to their traditions, Allah said to Jibril to say to Muhammad, verse by verse by verse, over a period of 22 years.
And then here we have basically the opposite. We have that it supposedly descended within a night. However, it bears saying that in the context of Surah 97 here, that it doesn't actually use the word Quran. So what we would be doing here is reading the standard Islamic narrative in as devil's advocate to say, okay, then it would be that this is the Quran having been descended, and it descends in a night. So is it in the night of determination, month of determination, month of Ramadan, night of Ramadan? Who knows? So is it a night? Is it a month? Is it a night? Or is it 22 years according to the narrative?
Probably lots of people who have been watching a lot of content about the Quran and how it became a thing would have heard it to be a Keriana. I don't know if Christoph Luxemburg is the first one that actually comes up with that. Probably quite a few people said that. And the reason is that a Keriana is an actual thing. It is an actual, there are scriptures used for ecclesiastical service. So you would have heard that, and it is, Keriana. But I think the reason is that between Quran and Keriana, they have quite a few words that are letters that are kind of similar, and they are both supposed to be books. So when you are looking for something that means a book, and you're looking at the word Quran, you will actually come across the word Keriana. But Keriana, or like most people will describe it, is a lectionary. Is the Quran is not that. It's actually something very different to that. So when we try to find an excuse for the word, thinking that it is a book, we cannot actually get to that answer. But now we have seen so far that the word is not used for the actual book, for an actual book, until much later. In the beginning, they have a book, and these words are written there, but they haven't associated Quran with the book. Also, we have seen that in the manuscripts that they would have to add things. In fact, if we even ignore the vocalization, the hamzas, they weren't there because they didn't exist. They were invented later. So not a single hamza of Quran is in the Quran because they didn't exist. They are all insertions, but perfect preservation. And even alifs, like we've seen in that wonderful manuscript where you have in the same screenshot, so on the same page, you have Quran written twice, and twice they've added an alif late. So you would have to really suspend your, great suspension of disbelief to think, oh, well, the same guy didn't know how to spell the most important word in their history, in their traditions, which is the name of their all important book. So he made the same mistake twice, and someone has to come up later and correct it because he didn't know how to spell Quran. If he didn't know how to spell Quran, he would not have been writing the Quran, which has survived to this day. So Keriana is that word that is, I've always thought that it was going to be lectionary, but that was a way, I believe it is a way of coping because the Quran has to be a book. But now we have seen it can't, it is something else. And the Keriana thing doesn't seem to actually fit. We find words or basically things that are missing within the actual manuscripts. We find things that have been changed. And if you are familiar with the works of the professionals like Daniel Brubaker, you would be not surprised about the words that I'm saying because he shows things that have been edited, changed, added late, and this whole thing. So this happens a lot. Now, one of the things that we see very clearly in these manuscripts is that they don't really have dots. If you look at Arabic as it is written now, it is full of dots, dashes, so the diacritical marks, the vocalization. These things were introduced late. And when we see that the Quran meant something very different and then they twisted the meaning, we obviously don't take it as gospel that the words in the Quran now, like for example, well, whichever qira'at you actually pick, is what it was written. What was written was this. And someone at one point, they start adding dots and dashes and all of those things. And the meaning changes. Kash and I have found quite a few of those already, and I think this shouldn't be a mystery to anyone. Now, for this particular topic, the word that we have here is Quran, with a definite article. So it is read from right to left, and you can see, so the first character in there is the Alif, Lam, Kaf, Ra, Alif, Nun. Now, that doesn't really read Quran, although obviously Muslims will say, no, you know that is Quran because you would know how to read it. But we have just established that they didn't even call it Quran until much later. Now, in order to arrive to the word Quran, a number of things had to happen. One is that, is a Dhamma. So then this is pronounced Quran, instead of Kar. And the other one is the actual Hamza. And the Hamza is quite important. We have seen it is introduced late. I think the dates given, they will always stretch them and say, well, they begin to appear maybe in the late 7th century and then they are canonized by the 10th century. Based on what we can see, is probably more on the later end of that period. And also, all of these writings would be from the Islamic sources. So how much we can actually take for granted that, oh yes, sure, they happen in the 7th century. It's like, no, think 9th, 10th century, or something like that. Now, one of the problems with Quran is that when you add the Hamza, it actually changes the word completely, changes the meaning, and we are going to go through all of that in a little bit. Actually, we have a lot of that.
a keen eye will very quickly see that this aleph that you see in the top, red circle, that one as well as the one in the bottom one, you can see it even like, fade a little bit more, right? Suggesting that its inking was not the same inking as the consistent non-degraded cases we see. But either way, about degradation or not degradation, it's the same situation because those aleph do not have their proper spacing. Those were added in. They're smaller than normal aleph. They were squeezed into the text after the initial inking. So this is another hand, maybe another person, but if it's the same scribe, it's definitely at a different time. Which
And they are
that suggests, right? That suggests that the aleph tradition. There's a couple options here. One is that what we read as Quran today could have been multiple different words that all became and were standardized as Alif Lam Q R Alif Hamza N, right? Or Hamza Alif N, right? As in all of them eventually become this exact spelling that's rendered today as Quran. However, there could have been some that was just QRN or some that were QR Alif N. That's an option that's open. But at the very, very least, what this shows is that whatever this word Quran is that there was, I guess, some funny business going on.